Welcome. We're going to finish off chapter 26. And what is nice is it does address some of the graphing for those of you who do not have any experience in microeconomics. We developed the aggregate demand curve. We developed the aggregate supply curve. And as you can see, this is aggregate supply in the short run. And I know that by the nature of the shape of the curve. I always look for full employment. And I recognize full employment seems to be always that point where the general slope of the curve begins to change. Fortunately, this is not a calculus-based economics class, in which case all you need to do is remember what Alex and I talked about per unit production costs. So let us analyze and show you what is expected of you. This is an aggregate demand increase resulting in demand pull inflation. First thing to know, how do I know it's an increase? It is not the notation of the curves, though you must always communicate that. It is very important that you guys always draw in an arrow showing direction from which curve to which curve. That implies this is the initial aggregate demand curve, and this is what has occurred. So the aggregate demand curve has shifted to the right. Why is that? Well, we started talking about some of the reasons why an aggregate demand curve should shift. So this is simply a notational issue. So what I can say now is, oh, hey, aggregate demand has shifted from 81 to 82. Once again, I would encourage you guys to choose notation that makes sense to you, make it relative to the problems at hand, and always label things what we are consistently use in class. Now, ladies and gentlemen, since this was where we were at full employment, we are now operating outside of the PPC, and that is what we've already defined to be a positive GDP gap. So what we need to look at now is, well, what is going on? Well, there's two scenarios here. One scenario is, had the price level remained at P sub 1, what would have occurred would have been the full strength multiplier effect. And once again, that multiplier effect was developed in a previous class. But what had happened, instead of moving over here to Q sub 2, once again, had price level remained at P sub 1, this would have been your full multiplier effect. But what happened is that prices in the general price level moved. And as a result, we're actually going to be producing now a Q sub 1. So one more time, inflation, the general price level moving up, has reduced the potential increase in real output. Instead of being at Q sub 2, it is now at Q sub 1. We could work that in the other direction. If there was an aggregate demand decrease, and of course, we like to link things to the business cycle. So now we're talking about recession and the concern of cyclical unemployment. In this case, let's say that investment spending substantially declines because of the lower expansion of capital. Well, I want to take this blue premise and say, okay, that affects aggregate demand. In this case, 81 is going to shift to 82, but it will be a decrease in aggregate demand as opposed to an increase. Now, as I look to my graph, where we were before, 81 in the air supply curve was at full employment. Since I am now operating at output below full employment output, that is going to be a negative GDP gap. Once again, think about the production possibilities curve. Actual GDP is less than the potential GDP. And now let's take a look at the price level. Before, the price level is at P sub 1. If there had the price level remained there, and there was no drop in the price level, then that would have been the full strength multiplier effect which would have occurred. And real output would have receded to Q sub 1, more so, ladies and gentlemen. So one more time, real output would have receded from Q sub F to Q sub 1. But it did not. And the question is, why hasn't it? But I think what we really want to recognize is, well, if we reduce from Q sub 1 to Q sub 1 from Q sub F, what are we getting? Well, definitely, ladies and gentlemen, that is the issue. You're getting recession and cyclical unemployment, ladies and gentlemen. Resources are going to begin to lie idle. And of course, under conditions of scarcity, that seems to be never a particularly good thing. So I would say, hey, what do I get? I get recession. And what accompanies that? Oh, I'm always going to say cyclical unemployment, the undesirable category of unemployment. This idea that goods that people produce are wanted, it's just nobody's buying them. And those people do have the prerequisite skills to produce those goods. It's just that they're not finding themselves with jobs. But once again, what would minimize the impact of a multiplier effect, whether it's this scenario? What would minimize the impact of multiplier effect, whether it's this scenario? And as you can see, it's whether or not the general price level can move. So in this case, if it's opposed to reducing all the way to Q sub 1, it is minimized and it only drops to Q sub 2. The GDP gap is not as large, but that is under the assumption that P sub 1 moves down to P sub 2. So let's just think about what goes on in our world today, and let's think about, well, hey, why exactly, and this is often what is referred to in Keynesian theory as sticky wages, why do price levels tend to be a tad bit inflexible in the downward direction especially? Could it be price wars? Ladies and gentlemen, when I think about large companies competing for your business, whether it's someone like Walmart and Amazon, or you think of Southwest, United, and the airlines industries, at some point, maybe they recognize how disastrous a price war is as prices are going down to their profits. And as such, what you have is some sort of a relative stalemate where each one of them would like to take customers from the other. Typically, they can lower the price level, but you can only do that to some particular point. If you're in microeconomics, you would have studied the behavior of a model referred to as an oligopoly in game theory. Maybe perhaps there's what are called menu costs, ladies and gentlemen, and how when you change prices, it involves a whole lot of other costs to a business. And of course, you guys being young, most of your experiences as consumers might be thinking, oh, no, it's just as quickly as changing a price. No, ladies and gentlemen, it is not. This is thousands of potential dollars, which increases a cost to a business. Just another reason why maybe businesses are not prone to drop prices. And then we discuss wage contracts. I know many of you have seen, I always put this slide up because I think of our school, and I know you saw many teachers wearing these red shirts once, and they were walking around our building, ladies and gentlemen. And that is the issue of what typically are referred to unions or associations and wage contracts. And as groups of individuals, employees attempt to better their wages relative to management, and how management is looking at costs and how they would like to drive down costs, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe it is these wage contracts which lead to this price inflexibility. Or, and we always mentioned at this point, the word that Mr. President-elect Joe Biden is looking to raising the minimum wage. I did discuss that in class at the federal level. What about this issue? If we can't lower prices because there's laws in place, we discussed in microeconomics this concept of ceilings and floors, and the idea that you can't not go any lower than a price floor, and that is what minimum wage is. It is a price floor. Prices just cannot go down lower for inputs. As such, they're kind of stuck there. And we're talking about this concept of sticky wages. So what about the aggregate supply side? Because we did work on developing both the aggregate supply in the immediate, in the short run, and the long run. And we discussed aggregate supply shifters. So let's say for some particular reason, aggregate supply was to decrease. And this now, once again, is inflation coming from the supply side as opposed to inflation coming from the demand side, ladies and gentlemen. So one more time. This is called demand pull inflation because it is aggregate demand that is causing that rise in the general price level. On the flip side, this, of course, is coming from the supply side, so it is called cost push inflation. One more time. Since it's a decrease in aggregate supply, it is pushing the price upward. If it is a movement to the right in the aggregate demand, it is pulling the price upward. So for whatever reason, we see that the aggregate supply curve has decreased. Therefore, real output is going to decline from Q sub F to Q sub 1. And this is a negative GDP gap. Now, the question is, how much is the negative GDP gap? Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is often going to be a skill required of you on AP, and you're going to have to read graphs using abstract notation. The amount clearly is this amount, which using Euclidean geometry is this entire segment taking away this entire segment. So often you could say, it is this to here. People say Q sub 1 O and use Q sub F O and subtract the 2. I'm just going to give the value of Q sub F because Q sub F minus 0 is, of course, Q sub F, and the value of Q sub 1 because Q sub 1 minus 0, of course, is Q sub 1, ladies and gentlemen. So just be aware, you're going to be asked to recognize values abstractly, and that's exactly how much it is that we are below full employment. So what if there was an aggregate supply increase, full employment, and there was price level stability? Well, let's think about this. Let's say for some particular reason, aggregate demand increased from 81 to 82, and there's my arrow noting it as an increase. So let me put some values in here for you guys. 81, 82. There it is. That by itself is going to cause a change in real output. So if I'm reading my graph, 81 AS1 is where we initially were, which would have been output at, let's say, Q sub 2. Oh, excuse me, 81 and AS1 right here, output at Q sub 1, my bad. As a result, aggregate demand shifted to the right, which means I need to look at the new output level, which would have been where 82 intersects AS1. And therefore, that alone would cause real output level to rise from Q sub 1 to Q sub 2. And what we're seeing, of course, is the price level is changing also. So the initial price level was at P sub 1, but now we're at P sub 3. What is really nice, despite how complicated these may look, is you guys have been reading graphs for the last 18 years of your mathematical lives. But let's say on top of that, there was an increase in productivity, which we know will affect the aggregate supply side. And in this case, if it's an increase in productivity, that would lower per unit production costs, and aggregate supply itself would increase, which we've noted, AS1 shifting to AS2. Now that causes the real output to rise from where to where? Well, we're now at Q sub 2, but when I notice the aggregate supply curve has shifted, I'm now at Q sub 3. So we're actually getting more output as a result for this change in aggregate supply. So what has happened when you get more real output, ladies and gentlemen? Well, that puts pressure on the price level to move the other direction, causing the price level to move downward from where we were, P sub 3, now down to P sub 2. Why were we at P sub 3? That was due to the shift in aggregate demand. Why is the price level moving downward? Because there's been a shift in aggregate supply, but it's been an increase. So as we can see, ladies and gentlemen, is these subtle nuances and changes in the graph. And this comes down to goods and services. That's what I make sure you always understand. Goods and services are produced, and we measure a certain standard of living by those goods and services available for consumers to buy, ladies and gentlemen. So once again, what am I seeing here? I saw an aggregate demand increase, which raised the general price level, inflation. I've seen an aggregate supply increase, which actually lowers the general price level. So when it's all said and done, ladies and gentlemen, I am back to that general relative price level, which is now established a new full employment level. Ladies and gentlemen, that's more important to understand. What we have is economic growth. The PPC has moved outward, therefore there is a new amount, once again, a new amount of real domestic output that defines full employment. Please make sure you always reference the text if necessary and take a look at those practice multiple choice questions, and have a great day.